Welcome. We would be learning concept of effective sensibility factor. This effective sensibility factor we have come across many times, and there needs to be some clarification as to how exactly this factor is different from uh, room sensibility factor. So this is the objective of this small video. So need to remember these terms because many times there is a bit of confusion, and especially there are a lot of short forms wherein you would come across. For example, this effective sensibility factor ERSHF and room sensibility factor. This is sorry RSHF. So definitions you might know as to what is effective sensibility factor. Many times students they do say that effective sensibility factor is a ratio of so and so. For example, when it's asked as to what is effective sensibility factor, pat comes the reply that effective sensibility factor is the ratio of effective room sensible heat upon the effective room sensible heat plus effective room latent heat, right? Sorry, plus effective room latent heat. But does not make any sense as to what exactly this means. You can put some other formula, and that formula comes like what is then effective room sensible heat. So I'll just type this down. Effective room sensible heat is equal to, and this would start making a sense bit when I put this now, plus let us say OSH. Now one more term I am introducing, OSH, which is O for outside air sensible heat, outside air sensible heat into bypass factor, and then similar to that, effective room latent heat would be in, yeah, correct, it would be in RLH plus O A, sorry, OALH, which is right outside air latent heat into bypass factor. Okay, now what does this mean? What all these formulas would convey? That we need to be very clear. So for that, let me use a small figure. Let us say this is your room, okay, and this room is to be conditioned, okay. And we said that when you talk about this room and we talk about, let us say, how much capacity of the air conditioning has to be, air conditioner has to be installed here, we first start with estimating what is the load on this room, and then that we call it as room total heat, which is nothing but the load because of sensible heating and room load because of latent heating. We had discussed this many times that room sensible heat means the load because of temperature change. So the parameters which would change the temperature of the room, the factors which would change the temperature of the room, they are termed under room sensible heat. This we had discussed in the last video also. We had discussed that. So now what is the effective room sensibility? Because room sensibility, I told you that the factors Let me erase this. Okay. Okay. So let us say this room sensible heat would include everything which would change the temperature of the load, temperature of the room, and let me use some other color. Okay. And the room latent heat would include all the factors which would change the moisture of the room, right? So this is the sensible load and this is the latent load. Now what is this effective means? So for understanding that, we need to consider this in context of the coil. Now let me draw a coil here. Let us put a coil here. Let us say a small coil. Say this is a coil. This is your coil. Okay, right? Let me call it as a coil. Okay, this AC coil, what it does is it would condition the air, right? And now when you are talking about this AC coil, you can imagine, and it's pretty easy to imagine, that the conditioned air would flow from this coil to this room. Conditioned air would flow from this coil to this room. So what enters this coil is what enters this coil is the unconditioned air, and what leaves this coil is the conditioned air. Okay. So what enters the coil is the unconditioned air. What leaves the coil is the conditioned air. Whatever is entering this AC coil, if we are talking about recirculation, then you would find that this which is entering the AC coil would include the return air which comes from the room, and it would also include the fresh air. So let me write down this. So whatever enters this would include fresh or ventilation air plus and the return air. Now what leaves this coil is theoretically what would leave this coil is the conditioned air, right? So the unconditioned air enters and the conditioned air would leave this coil. Where it will go? This conditioned air would go into this conditioned air would go into this room. Okay, this room, and it will condition the room. That is what it is. Now if the coil is a perfect coil, if the coil is a perfect coil, it means that the bypass factor would be 0. If it is an ideal coil, then the bypass factor would be 0. So let me write down the ideal coil here, somewhere here. Ideal coil would mean bypass factor is 0. So ideal coil bypass factor is 0. So if you put this 0 over here in this expression, so what you find is a very interesting thing. Effective room sensible heat, if you put 0 over here, is the room sensible heat. And effective room latent heat is equal to room latent heat. It means that this effective term has to do with something which is bypassed. And if you concentrate on this, you'll understand what exactly is this effective kind of thing. So concentrate on this expression now. Because this bypass factor is not 0, hence your effective room sensible heat is not equal to room sensible heat. Because this bypass factor is not 0, effective room latent heat is not equal to room latent heat. Means what exactly must be happening because of this bypass factor? So if you recollect our discussion on what is bypass factor, you would understand that this bypass factor is what? So this bypass factor is some of the air would bypass. Okay, some of the air would bypass, and let me use some other color here. This would bypass and reach the room. So this bypass element, okay, let us say that this jumping, I'll just draw a very interesting diagram now. I'll draw jumps. Okay, so bypass. Where it is going now? Bypassing. It is bypassing and entering this room. So this bypassed component is also entering this room. Okay, so this outside air, which is, or the fresh air or the outside air, which is being bypassed, which is bypassing the AC coil, and instead of getting condition, this fresh air, not the return air, even if the return air bypasses, it does not add to the load. If the fresh air bypasses the coil, it means that that fresh air, so much part, how much part of this fresh air? Very small part of that fresh air, which is bypassed, enters the room unconditioned. And the one which pass, the fresh air which passes the AC coil, it is conditioned. But the one which is bypassing this AC coil enters the room unconditioned. And when it enters the room unconditioned, what happens is that the load of the room changes. So now it is no longer the room sensible heat load or no longer the room latent heat load. It is now a new load, an additional load, which includes OASH into bypass factor. OALH into bypass factor. So this ERSH now is what? It is the effective load on the room, which would include not only the room sensible heat, but also the load because of the bypassed air. Similarly, the effective room latent heat would not simply include the RLH component, but it would also include the load, the additional latent heat load, which comes from this bypass air. So if this is clear, you would understand that the effective sensible heat factor is a more appropriate parameter than room sensible heat factor, because it takes into account the heat load of the outside air, which is bypassing the coil. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you have understood the concept of the effective sensible heat factor. If you are not understood, go back to the video, listen once again. Thank you. Have a nice day.